So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today's lecture is with regard to the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere as well as the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. You can recall that the other time, the previous lecture we discussed extensively on the superior lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere or of the cerebral cortex. So today we are going to complete the three surfaces, and then finally we'll discuss both the internal gray and white matters as well as other important areas from the outside of the cerebral hemisphere. So if you now take the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, the picture is going to be like this. That means by the time you now make a cross-section of the cerebral hemispheres, you know, as I told you before, in the midline, that's what we call medial or longitudinal fissure or medial longitudinal fissure, anyone. But then the correct name is longitudinal fissure. So when you now cut across that, you separate the two cerebral hemispheres together, left and the right one. So, and then you look at it from this side. So this is exactly what we are going to see. So on the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere, the important structures that can be noticed is the one important gyrus, what we call cingulate gyrus. This cingulate gyrus is immediately above one of the best commissural fibers, what we call the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum, which is the commissural fibers, the cingulate gyrus lies immediately above it. And in between the corpus callosum and the cingulate gyrus, which is this one, there is one layer of gray matter there, which I didn't put inside in between. So here in between the cingulate gyrus and the top part of the cingulate gyrus, there is what we call indusium gracium. This is indusium gracium. So this indusium gracium is a plate or sheet of gray matter lying in between the superior aspect of the corpus callosum and the inferior surface of the cingulate gyrus. You will see one very large sulcus here separating the cingulate gyrus of what we call superior frontal gyrus, which, if you can remember, on the superior lateral aspect of the cerebral cortex, we discussed the division of the frontal, frontal cortex into superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. So this superior frontal gyrus also fold into the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. So now we can see some part of the superior frontal gyrus, and just behind it here, this is just the central sulcus. So behind the central sulcus here is what we call paracentral lobule, and that is part of the postcentral gyrus and also part of the primary somatosensory area there. So from this paracentral lobule and this paracentral parieto-occipital sulcus, there is what we call, I think this is the parieto-occipital sulcus here. And so in between the parieto-occipital sulcus and this paracentral lobule here, that's what we call a pericuneus. This pericuneus is also one important gyrus, and after that, immediately below it, that's what we call cuneus. So this cuneus is part of the occipital lobe or occipital cortex. So here, if you can see here on the medial side, we can see the calcarine sulcus. So the calcarine sulcus plus the parieto-occipital sulcus, they go together towards the temporal lobe or temporal cortex. So we have now seen the corpus callosum here, and so just below the corpus callosum, there is also another form of commissural fibers, what we call the phonics, which we'll discuss later on. And phonics is part of the limbic system, and we are going to discuss it later on. So in between the corpus callosum, which is also a commissural fibers, and also the phonics, which is also part of the commissural fibers, there is one sheet of membrane there covering the space between the two. And that is what we call septum pellucidum. This septum pellucidum covers one space that is located inside this cerebral hemisphere. This space is the lateral ventricle, which we are going to discuss all the spaces with regard to the cerebral hemisphere and the spinal cord as well as the brainstem. So we have seen that septum pellucidum covers the space that is inside the cerebral hemisphere, and that space is what we call lateral ventricle. And immediately below the phonics, which is this one, there's also another space. This space, I told you before, is the third ventricle. This third ventricle, when you now combine the two cerebral hemispheres together, that space in between the two is what we call the third ventricle. So it means that third ventricle is only one cavity when you combine the two cerebral hemispheres together, but the lateral ventricles, you have one on the left side, and then you have one on the other side. And so we can only see two spaces in the cross-section of the cerebral hemisphere. That is the lateral ventricle covered by the septum pellucidum, and then below the phonics you have the third ventricle. And so by the time you now look at the temporal lobe here, if you can remember, we have made mention one fissure or sulcus that demarcates the frontal lobe of the temporal lobe below here. And that is what we call lateral sulcus of Sylvius. And this lateral sulcus of Sylvius here, as it extends like that, you are going to see that the temporal lobe here bends backward. That extension of the temporal lobe just immediately behind the lateral sulcus of Sylvius, that portion of the temporal lobe is what we call uncus. This uncus is part of the olfactory system that we are going to discuss later on. So we have now seen the uncus that is also present on the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere. So now, as I said earlier, to recap what I made mention before, when you look at the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere, you are going to see some important structures. Number one is the corpus callosum, which is part of the commissural fibers that links the two cerebral hemispheres together, linking identical areas from the left cerebral hemisphere with the right cerebral hemisphere. And so when you cut across it, you are going to see it like this. Similarly, below the corpus callosum, as I said earlier, you are going to see another commissural fibers, what we call the phonics. And this phonics, as I said, is part of the limbic system, which we are also going to discuss later on in the next lecture or in the next video. And immediately above the corpus callosum, we have one very large gyrus. That large gyrus is what we call cingulate gyrus or cingulate gyrus. So in between the cingulate gyrus or gyrus and the corpus callosum, there is a sheet of gray matter, and that is the inducium gracium. And we will discuss its own function also. And so above the cingulate gyrus, we also have what we call the part of the superior frontal gyrus that is also on the superior-lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere itself. And so, as I told us before, immediately behind the superior frontal gyrus here, after the central sulcus here, you have what you call the paracentral lobule. And behind the paracentral lobule, you have, in between it and the occipital lobe, you have what we call the precuneus. This precuneus is also part of the parietal lobe. And so immediately after the parieto-occipital sulcus and the calcarine sulcus, that small portion of it is what we call cuneus. This cuneus is part of the occipital lobe. And so the calcarine sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus from the medial side, they unite together to form a wide stem-shaped sulcus that nearly extend into the temporal lobe. And so we have now seen that in between the corpus callosum and the fornix, we have one space that is being covered by a septum, and that septum is called septum pellucidum, and that space that is covered by that septum is what we call the lateral ventricle. And I also said that mainly below the fornix, we have another space when you combine the two cerebral hemispheres together, and so it is a single space, and that space is called third ventricle. So it means that there must be first and the second ventricles. The reason why this one are called lateral ventricles, not first and the second, ideally they're supposed to be first and the second ventricles, and then this should be called the third ventricle, because you have one ventricle here, you also have another ventricle in the other cerebral hemisphere. So you have the first one, you have the second one. But whether you call the right the first, or the left the first, or the right the first, or whatever, is all the same. That is why it is called lateral ventricle. So you are going to be confused when you say you are going to call the lateral, the left ventricle first ventricle, or the right ventricle first ventricle. So it's going to be confusing. And that is why the two names together, first and the second, they are all given the same name. Lateral ventricles, because they are all on the inside each of the cerebral hemisphere, and they're all the same, and they're all on the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, even though there are some extension of these spaces both in the anterior side of the cerebral cortex, in the middle, and also in the posterior aspect, which we're also going to discuss later on. So now this is just the simple explanation of the middle side of the cerebral hemisphere. And so when we now look at the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere, there are many sectors that are going to be seen when you now look at the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. You are not yet, conversant with the cranial nerves that I have given you an introduction before, but then I think I've told you that we have the second cranial nerve, that is the optic nerve. This optic nerve, some of its fibers crisscross at the base of the skull, and so after crisscrossing there, it forms what we call optic chiasma. So this is optic chiasma, the crisscrossing of the fibers of the optic nerve. That is the second cranial nerve that I made mention before. So that optic nerve crisscrosses at the base of the inferior surface of the two cerebral hemispheres, and so it forms this optic chiasma. So that chiasma is the X-shaped formation of the crisscrossing fibers of the second cranial nerve, that is the optic nerve. And so if you can recollect your anatomy vividly very well, this is just the anterior aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, and this is the posterior aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the inferior aspect. So I will be referring anything here as posterior to this optic chiasma. So immediately behind the optic chiasma, because this is the inferior surface, this is the anterior aspect. So should I now fold this to face like this? So the crisscrossing fibers of the optic chiasma are going to be like this. And so anything, this is anterior, this is posterior. So I'm referring to anything behind this. So immediately behind the optic chiasma, this place, there is a stalk of the pituitary gland. And that stalk of the pituitary gland, it is, around one very large swelling at the base of the cerebral hemisphere. That large swelling here is what we call tuber cinereum. Immediately behind the tuber cinereum, that contains that stalk of the pituitary gland, immediately behind the tuber cinereum, you have two swellings. Two round swellings. And these two round swellings are what we call mammillary bodies, singular mammillary body. And so we are also going to discuss what are these mammillary bodies when we are discussing the limbic system and other part of the gray matters of the cerebral hemispheres. And behind the two mammillary bodies, there is one small area there that is being perforated by small arteries. This area behind the two mammillary bodies at the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere, that area is what we call posterior perforated substance. We call it what? Posterior perforated substance. Why? Because it is perforated by small arteries going into the substance of the cerebral hemisphere. So the place is called what? Posterior perforated substance. So now since we have posterior perforated substance, obviously we should have anterior perforated substance. So now we've seen that. So this posterior perforated substance is just behind it. We have the portion of the midbrain, and here you have the cerebral peduncles coming from the cerebral cortex. Those fibers coming from the internal capsule, which we are going to discuss later on. So these fibers, they now form a fossa here. And this fossa in between these two here is what we call interpeduncular fossa. So this, because each of this one here is called cerebral peduncle. Cerebral what? Cerebral peduncle. The two together are called cerebral peduncles. So these cerebral peduncles, as they descend from the internal capsule like that, so they now enclose a space here. All this is what we call interpeduncular fossa. So in the interpeduncular fossa, we have tuber cinereum, we have two mammillary bodies, we have posterior perforated substance. Are you all clear? Good. So we now know the content of the interpeduncular fossa. And if we now want to talk about the boundaries of the interpeduncular fossa, we will say that posteriorly it is bounded by the two cerebral peduncles, and anteriorly it is bounded by the optic chiasma. Are you clear? And you can also state that within the fossa you have these contents that I've already stated: the tuber cinereum, the two mammillary bodies, and the posterior perforated substance. Part of the boundary of the interpeduncular fossa is the anterior aspect of the midbrain, because this is the midbrain here, and so if you tilt it like this, this is the anterior part of the midbrain. So part of the posterior boundary of the interpeduncular fossa is the midbrain. So we have now seen, the content of that fossa. So when you now come and look at the actual inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere, we have what we call orbital surface of the inferior surface. We have tentorial surface of the inferior surface of each of the cerebral hemisphere. So now, since we know that there is this division, what is the demarcating landmark for the two surfaces? If you can remember, like the way I discussed this, lateral sulcus or lateral fissure of Sylvius, here is the same fissure, that curves across, So this lateral sulcus of Sylvius is the one that demarcates the orbital surface of the tentorial surface. This orbital surface is because it's lying over the anterior cranial fossa, and that flow of the anterior cranial fossa within the cranium forms the roof of the orbit. I already discussed with you in the other time, and so that is where that surface, because it is in connection, is lying on the floor of the anterior cranial fossa, and that floor of the anterior cranial fossa forms the roof of the orbit, and that is where that surface is called orbital surface of the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And so here, the tentorial surface is because it's lying on the tentorium cerebelli, one tent-like structure that covers the cerebellum, and that is what we call tentorium cerebelli. And that tent-like membrane that covers the superior aspect of the cerebellum in the back of the posterior cranial fossa, So because this surface is in relation with that tentorium cerebelli, so this surface is called tentorial surface. So what are the features that we can see in the orbital surface of the cerebral hemisphere? Here on the inferior surface of the orbital surface, towards the midline now there's one sulcus. That means there's one depression here. That depression is what we call olfactory sulcus. And that olfactory sulcus harbors or contains one tract, what we call olfactory tract. And this olfactory tract begins from olfactory bulb. And that olfactory bulb is formed by the nerve fibers taking origin from our roof of the nose. In our nose, we have some special receptors, what we call olfactory receptors. Those receptors, as they receive sense of smell from our external environment, it is these olfactory receptors that carry information to what we call olfactory fibers, which they combine together to form olfactory nerve fibers, and then they pass through the cerebral plate of the skull, and then they combine together to form this olfactory bulb at the base of the orbital surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And this bulb continues backward as the olfactory tract. And this olfactory tract divides into two stems. That's what we call medial stem and lateral stem. And so the medial stem and the lateral stem, they enclose a space, which is a triangular space here. So this triangular space anteriorly is bounded by the medial stem and the lateral stem of the olfactory tract, and then posteriorly it is bounded by part of the optic chiasma. And so this space is also being perforated by small arteries to go and supply the areas around the inferior aspect of the orbital surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And so this area, because it is also perforated by those by arteries, and it is because it is anterior, that is why it is called anterior perforated substance. So we have now seen the difference between the anterior perforated substance and the posterior perforated substance. This one is in relation to the two stems of the optic tract, olfactory tract, while the posterior perforated substance is with regard to the interpeduncular fossa, where it is bounded anteriorly by the two mammillary bodies and posteriorly by the anterior aspect of the midbrain. So now we have seen that. So on the medial side of this optic tract, there is one large gyrus here, or large gyrus here. This large gyrus here is what we call rectus gyrus, or straight gyrus. That means because it is straight, that is why it is called rectus gyrus. Anything from the word rectus, in Latin it is called straight. So you have a straight gyrus here that is lying medial to the olfactory tract. So on the lateral side of the olfactory tract, the area there is divided into 4 gyri, what we call orbital gyri, by a figure H sulcus, what we call orbital sulcus. That orbital sulcus is in figure of H. So dividing the inferior aspect of the lateral side of the orbital surface into 4 gyri: anterior, posterior, medial, and lateral orbital gyri. You can as well call them anterior, posterior, lateral, and medial inferior frontal gyri at the orbital surfaces. But you have to qualify that at its orbital surface, because there, if you can remember, on the superior lateral surface, we also have inferior frontal gyrus. When you now come to the tentorial surface, the tentorial surface here, if you look at it, it is demarcated by two important sulci. The first one on the lateral side is what we call occipito-temporal, from the occipital lobe down to the temporal lobe. That is occipito-temporal sulcus, And then you have what you call collateral sulcus. In some textbooks, they call it lateral occipito-temporal sulcus and medial occipito-temporal sulcus. It all makes sense. Which either way you call it is the same. But then in most of the textbooks, they call this one on the lateral side, they call it occipito-temporal sulcus, and this one on the medial side is called collateral sulcus. So by these two sulci, the inferior or the tentorial surface of the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere is divided into gyri. The one on the lateral side is called lateral temporal gyrus. The one next to it here is called medial temporal gyrus. And then the one that is towards the midline, this one is what we call para-hippocampal gyrus. Because next to it is what you call the hippocampal gyrus, which we'll discuss later on. So mainly anterior to this, para-hippocampal gyrus, here, if you can remember, I made mention about the uncus, and that is just the, extension of the temporal lobe, towards the medial side like this, and so it encloses a small, tongue-like, small gyrus like that, and that is what we call the uncus. And so, just on the lateral side of the uncus, you have one small sulcus, what we call renal sulcus. And so in between the uncus and the para-hippocampal gyrus, which is this one, there is another gyrus, what we call dentate gyrus. Which is this one. So we have dentate gyrus here that is lying in between the uncus, which is this one, and the para-hippocampal gyrus, which is this one. So here, everything here is the dentate gyrus here. So this is dentate gyrus. So here is para-hippocampal gyrus. And here you have your uncus, and here you have your medial temporal gyrus, and here you have your lateral temporal gyrus. So these are the structures that one can see when you look at the inferior aspect of each of the cerebral hemispheres. I think we can have a break, and then when we come back, we continue.